live. So what I do is I spotlight myself and no one else can see. And I put it on YouTube, so there's an archive. And also sometimes I put it on Facebook where there people can actually see it in live. There's some things that I sometimes say that when you put it on Facebook and live, YouTube is very easy to edit. And therefore, it's, give me one second. YouTube's easy to edit. So, but Facebook is not as easy to edit. So when you say controversial things, or you make a mistake, you say the wrong verse or the wrong thing, sometimes it's problematic. So let me just tell you a couple details of what we're going to study today. This week's Parsha is Parsha's Vayechi. Vayechi is the last Parsha in Genesis, in Bereshis. It is a Parsha, Vayechi means and he lived. It is a Parsha about Jacob's passing. The Jewish people finally settle in Egypt. Wow, what a trip. It's been Abraham, Isaac, and then the crazy story with Joseph. Last week, Joseph reunites with his dad, and the family of Jacob comes down to Egypt. Finally, they're living in a beautiful Jewish suburb of Egypt, and they have yeshivas and synagogues there, and they're really doing well. So Jacob, at the beginning of this Parsha, calls in Joseph, and he says, thank you. I'm so grateful that I was literally walking dead for so many years, knowing that my son was dead. And also, one of the interesting things is when Jacob was a seer, he was a prophet. And when Joseph was taken away, God did not want Jacob to know. So his prophecy left him. So he felt he was literally dead because his spiritual foresight was gone. God was upset with him. And now when Joseph came back, and he came back to Joseph, his seer abilities came back. So he gets there and he's in Egypt. He's resting in Egypt. And he calls in Joseph. And this is what we'll read just at the beginning of the Torah. He calls in Joseph. And right away it says, let me pull this up. Right away it says that he lived 17 years in Egypt, and those were his best years. And then he calls in Joseph, and he wants Joseph to make a promise to him. What promise does he want Joseph to make? He wants Joseph to promise. He says, "Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shvas shana, v'hi yimei Yaakov shnei chayev shava shanim ba'arba ma'as shana." Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years, and these were the years of his life. He was 147 years. So Jacob did not live such a long life like his forefathers, but that's life. He only lived 147. He calls in Joseph and he says, "Joseph, you are the king of Egypt. You're second to the king. I want you to make a promise to me." What is the promise? Promise me that you will bury me in Israel. I don't want to be buried in the cave of the patriarchs. I want to be buried in Maras HaMachpelah. In Hebron, I want to be buried in a special cave where Abraham and Isaac and Adam and Eve, right, and my wife Leah, where they were all buried. Please promise me that you'll do it. Now, he actually tells him, he says, "I know I didn't bury your mother there, but know that was because God didn't want her to be buried there." We know in Jewish history later, when the Jewish people were exiled from Jerusalem, they passed by Derech Ephras, they've passed by the burial place of Rachel. She's known as Mama Rachel. And when they passed by, they prayed at her place, and it says that her soul went up before God and said, "Hey, the Jews are going to exile. God, take it easy. Don't be too hard on them." So he said, that's why I had to bury her on the way there. Till today, it's a very special place to pray. When you go to Israel, when things open up and everyone goes to Israel on the JLI trip, they'll take them there. It's a very special place to pray. That was the story of Rachel. So he tells them, but I need to be buried in Maras HaMachpelah with my forefathers. And you're the only one who can do it. Now, why was it that he made him swear? So basically, when Jacob came into Egypt, the famine stopped. The waters from the Nile started rising. The famine was supposed to last 7 years. It only lasted 2 years. Because Jacob came, and the purpose of the famine was to get Jacob to Egypt. So the Egyptians thought he was a pretty cool guy, right? Jacob came to town, and the famine stopped. They wanted him to be buried in the soil there, or perhaps in the Nile, and that way, the land of Egypt will be blessed. Furthermore, as the Egyptians were back then, they wanted to serve him as an idol, right? They would want to serve him as an idol. That's what they would do, right? They would serve him as the idol. And, Jacob did so much. He did such a special thing. He stopped the famine. They would want to serve him as an idol. So he said, oh, I don't want that to happen to me. So here's what he told Joseph. He said, Joseph, bury me in Israel. Now, there's two other reasons. Another thing is that Jacob knew that he's going to be sitting in the soil, right? He's going to be sitting in the soil of Egypt, in the earth. And when the plague of lice would happen, it says that the earth became lice. That's how God did it. The earth became lice. That's like really straight out of a horror movie. The dirt became lice. And he said, I don't want to be sitting in the lice, right? I don't want to be sitting. It's disrespectful. I'm not excited for that. Another reason why, and this is something from the Talmud that we're going to talk about today, is this is one of the reasons why people would like to be buried in Israel. And I want to talk because I just happened to study something very fascinating recently about it. But he said, when Mashiach comes, so just share a quick anecdote. Someone called me a couple of weeks ago, and they said, I live in Phoenix, and, I have a relative in Prescott, blah, 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 blah. They said, yeah, we got in the conversation of Jewish burial. They said, I really want to be buried the Jewish way. I want to get a tahara. I want to be purified. So beautiful. But in Phoenix, they'd only do it if you keep Shabbos. So I said, do you know, so I know that's not true. I said, do you know Rabbi Levi Levertov? Do you know any Chabad rabbi? She said, yeah, I know. A little smile on seniors. So I said, Rabbi Levi Levertov is a member of the Chevra Kadisha of Phoenix. I think he might be able to pull off some connections with you and get it done with you, even if you don't keep Shabbos. So they said, no, really? I said, yeah, speak to him. Anyways, I called Rabbi Levi Levertov and I told him, I said, this person's probably going to call you. Anyways, he called the person and they said, yeah, they want to get a tahara, but they want to be cremated after, right? They want to be cremated after. So I said, okay, that's the problem. Okay, that's the tahara. Now, when you're dealing with any Jewish burial, it's important to note that all of the customs are all about resurrection of the dead. We have this body. We want the body to be prepared to be resurrected and live eternal life in this world in Israel. That's what we believe in. It's a staple of Jewish belief. It's not just not something that only the crazies believe. It's really a staple throughout our Jewish history, a staple of Jewish belief that there will be resurrection of the dead and the bodies will rebuild, which is an interesting subject, how they will rebuild and how the rabbis ask questions, how will it even be considered the same body? If the body disintegrates, how will it be even considered the same body? But that's a discussion for another time. But Jacob said, I know that when Mashiach comes, the resurrection of the dead will happen. The bodies in exile outside of Israel what will happen is first the bodies in Israel, buried in Israel, will get up. They'll just get straight up out of their grave, right? And then their bodies in exile will come. And how will they come? They'll go through tunnels underground. And it'll be painful. Some people it'll be like a roller coaster, but some people it'll be painful, right? They don't want to do that. So we'll talk a little bit about why that is, why they need to go through tunnels. And this is a fascinating thing I never knew. And what the significance, why can't we just get up in exile and take an airplane to Israel, right? If people are buried in exile, why do they have to go through tunnels underground? And why will the people in Israel get up first in the first place? Why don't we just do it at the same time? Maybe when Mashiach comes, we could just, take up the remains and clone them and we can put inject information into their brain and it'll be the same person, right? If we have their DNA, right? But why do they need to go underground and be built up in this special way? So this is some of the things we'll talk about today. So Jacob, anyways, just getting back to the Parsha. So I always mentioned that in the olden days, this was a hard thing to imagine, bodies getting up in the coming of Mashiach. But nowadays with technology, I don't know if technology is that far from bringing people back. I mean, people watch movies like Jurassic Park and they don't shut it off and say, this is ridiculous. It's an interesting idea, right? You have a fossilized mosquito, an amber, and they're able to bring back to life all these different things. Okay, So, but not going to those discussions so much. Jacob gets what he wants. The Midrash actually goes further and says Jacob dies, and Pharaoh says to Joseph, "Okay, we'll bury him here." And Joseph says, "No, I promised him that I would bury him in Israel." So he says, "Okay, so don't keep your promise. You know, we're pharaohs here. We can change our minds." So he tells him, he says, "If you make me break my promise, I will break my promise to you. Sorry, if you make me break my father's promise, I will break the promise I made to my father. I will break my promise to you as well." What was the promise Joseph made to Pharaoh? Pharaoh, as king, knew all 70 languages that existed in that era, except for one. He could just not get Hebrew. So if you have a hard time learning Hebrew, you're not alone. Pharaoh couldn't get it either. And he had the best tutors out there. And Joseph knew Hebrew. So Pharaoh did not want anyone to know that Joseph knew that he didn't know Hebrew. He wanted everyone to know that he'd think that he knew Hebrew. So he said, "If you make me break my promise to my father, I will break my promise to you." That is the story that we have. Pharaoh says, "Okay." So Jacob dies. He blesses his children. He leaves a will, which is a very important thing. We learn a lot of laws about wills in Jewish law and Jewish tradition from this week's parsha, about wills, about burial, about all sorts of things, about kavod hames, about mourning, about honoring the deceased. We learn all sorts of things, all great discussions, but I want to focus on a couple today, and we don't have that much time. So Joseph goes and they make a levaya. They take Jacob's remains and they take them to Israel. On the way there, people see Joseph's crown on his on his coffin or whatever it is, and the other kings join in. They see, wow, this is a special person. If the superpower of the world, second in command of the superpower, is honoring him so much. Jacob blesses his children. He doesn't want Levi to touch him, to carry him, because Levi, he tells Levi, your kids will be carrying the ark. It doesn't make sense for you to carry a body. Anyways, just another thing that we always ask is, why do they embalm him for 30 days? They embalm him and then they take him. So there is a Jewish law that, technically speaking, if it's for honoring the body, you're allowed to delay the preparations. We try to avoid it nowadays, nonetheless. But in those days, they knew to do that. So they honor him and then they bring his remains. They bring him there. Famous story in Egypt, in Israel. Esav is standing there and he says like this. Esav says, in the cave of the patriarchs, Adam and Eve are buried there. Abraham and Sarah are buried there. Isaac and Rebecca are buried there, right? Okay. And then there's two more places. The two more places are supposed to be for the heirs, Jacob and myself, Esav, right? Jacob buried Leah there, his wife. And it's true, he bought it from me, but he says, he denies that fact. He says he didn't buy it from me. So he says, you can't bury him here. This is my spot. Kind of interesting story. They send back one of the brothers to go get the deed for the cave of the patriarchs. And while they're there, Dun has a son who's deaf. And he tries to ask his brothers, what's going on here? And the brothers say, they try and explain to him, but he can't hear. So he goes and cuts Esav's head off because he sees something stopping the procession. Esav's head famously rolls into the cave, and there's a lot of significance there of Esav being really a holy source intentionally. His intentions were very holy and his potential was very holy, but he didn't act it out. He thought the thoughts, but he didn't talk the talk or walk the walk. So his heads were buried in the holy place. His head was buried in the holy place, but not his body. So Jacob gets buried there, and then the brothers come back, and it talks about their time in Egypt. And finally, Joseph dies, and only after the last brother dies, we start Shemos. Shemos is the story of Egypt, of Egyptian exile and Egyptian slavery, and that's what we'll read next week. This week, if we finish the Torah, we would say Chazak, Chazak, V'nis Chazek. We'd say, oh wow, we finished a book of the Torah. It's a very special thing, a very special celebration. But highly likely we won't have a minyan next week based on statistics. But who knows? So going back in the story, anyone have questions on the story? No questions? Okay. Going back on the story, I would like to talk about a couple details in the story. Now, first of all, many of us have been by burials and stuff like that. There's something quite interesting which I realized this year, which I would like to share, and I'm going to share a screen. It's quite interesting. Let me open it up. It's quite an interesting letter of the Rebbe. Now, this letter is about cremation, against cremation. The Rebbe talks about against cremation in this letter. But I would like to share, I never realized the significance in the background of the letter, and that's what I'd like to share today. And this is very, very interesting. Let me find this letter. 1 second. Stop share. New share. Show all windows. All right.
He's setting it up for the Zoom.
All right. Everyone with me? Everyone sees this?
Yes.
All right. So here's a letter I saw. So someone asked the Rebbe in this letter, I think it was a rabbi, he said, how do I convince someone not to cremate? Now, it's very enticing to cremate. First of all, in our lowly minds, it seems more spiritual than burial, right? In our lowly minds, it's like, oh, you make them into fire, you know? It seems more spiritual. But that's just because we're not very spiritual. We don't really see what's going on. But furthermore, this is the letter the Rebbe says, and I was always wondering what the Rebbe meant here, and I finally found somewhere that explains it really nicely. It says, to the one who wants, God forbid, to burn her body after death, one can say that it is clear, even elementary, that the body has continued existence, that is lifelike, even after the soul has ascended. And as long as the body has not completely decomposed, a part of the soul is still connected to it. All who command or who agree to the burning of one's body are agreeing to the burn a part of the soul, something akin to burning a person alive. Just that it is not the whole person, only a part, an unparalleled cruelty. This is true even when he's burning one's own soul, God forbid, and just justifying himself by ignorance of what he's doing. As for the argument that others have done this, there were thousands of Nazis who burned people who were fully alive, and among them were scientists, physicians, merchants, family men, etc. This is the letter of the Rebbe, one of the letters about it. And I want to just stop and focus on some of these things here. So I was always wondering what it means. What does it mean? So the Rebbe basically says, he says, after a person dies, the soul remains in the body. It's not like he's totally dead. The soul remains in the body. So just like, you wouldn't burn a person who's alive, even if they're sleeping, even if they're vegetable, even if they, God forbid, you wouldn't be able to see any reaction or any pain, you wouldn't do it, right? It would be like burning a part of the alive person. So the Rebbe says, even after someone passes, there is still a life force in their body, and it's hurting that life force. It's burning a live person. It's not a dead person until they decompose. And then he says, even though, you said people have done this, well, unfortunately, many Nazis have done it. And many of them were scientists, doctors, right? Doesn't make it right. So I want to share today an interesting excerpt of the Talmud, an explanation which I found from a great rabbi, who was Rabbi Meir ben Gabai, who lived in the 1500s, just post the Inquisition. He lived during the Inquisition. He was a very interesting Kabbalist, and he explains some very interesting things. So let me just find this, and I will share it. Any questions so far? No questions?
Rabbi Ellie?
Yeah.
So the belief was that the scientists, the people who were burned in the concentration camps, their souls, because they were burnt alive, their souls were still not just, they were not destroyed, they were, do we still feel that their souls are here somewhere?
Well, so people who were murdered in the Holocaust and people who were cremated in the Holocaust, obviously was not their fault, and obviously it wouldn't be held against them, and obviously it wouldn't be something which would cause any damage to them. It only makes the crime greater, right? It only makes the crime greater. So I remember hearing once from the Holocaust. What? Sorry.
Yeah. And they died. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, and they died as martyrs, so their souls would be.
Yeah, so they
eternal.
died as martyrs, and the fact they were burnt makes them even greater martyrs. Martyrs,
Yes.
Jewish martyrs always go straight to heaven, straight to finishing their job. They always have the best treatment, right? They did the holiest thing that a Jewish person could do. So that's all true. Now it only makes the crime greater. The suffering, so to speak, in our view, is much greater, and that's what makes them greater martyrs. But just going in, I remember hearing multiple times from Holocaust survivors saying, even though I don't believe in Judaism, because I don't believe in God, I'm going to be buried a Jew because I'm not letting any more Jewish bodies be burnt, right? They enough Jewish bodies were burnt in our generation, and that's an important thing to say. But here, I want to share a fascinating excerpt in the Talmud, which will explain this. So we said that the body, even after it dies, it contains the soul. Even after it dies, it contains the soul. Now, we obviously can't see that. Perhaps we have no measurement of it. Perhaps we do. The brain is such a complex device. I don't know. There may be some measuring tools that can see certain life in the brain even after the person dies. But that's not what we're going to talk about here. So here's an excerpt in the Talmud. It's a very fascinating excerpt in the Talmud. It says, let me go up a little bit. Okay, this is just an interesting thing. Amar Rav Yehuda, Meis she'ein le menachem hochen asar ben Adam v'yesh b'makamei. Hahu d'shchev v'shavusa de Rav Yehuda lo hayim menachem. Rav Yehuda says, in the case where a deceased person has no comforters, he has nobody to mourn for him, 10 people should go and sit in his place and accept condolences. So this is a very interesting excerpt in the Talmud. You have someone who has no children, no family. Maybe they're a convert, or maybe they just don't have any family. 10 people should go and sit in their place and accept condolences. They should celebrate Shiva there. They don't do a full Shiva, but they should do a procession for him. The Gemara relates a story of a certain person who died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighborhood who did not have any comforters. Kol yoma hava dvar Rabbi Yehuda be'asara b'yasivi b'duchte. Every day, one of the 7-day mourning period, Rabbi Yehuda would take 10 people and he would sit in his place in the house of the deceased. After 7 days, Rabbi Yehuda, had passed. The deceased appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and said to him, "Tanuach daitcha shenachta as daiti." Put your mind to rest, for you have put my mind to rest. So here we learn some interesting things. Number one, when we sit Shiva, someone's sitting Shiva, and we go and we tell them, we're here for you. We say, God should comfort you. We're not only comforting the mourners, but we're actually comforting the deceased, right? We're actually comforting the deceased. When people go, and I guess perhaps they create a legacy and they mourn for him, they're actually comforting the one who died. So just to take this a step forward, the person who dies, we're going to discuss exactly what happens to him. But, one thing that I know that is one good feeling that I have at funerals is as soon as the person's buried, I can see in the kids and myself, there's a certain level of rest and relaxation. Like, they're buried. They made it, right? Until then, there's havoc almost. People, they're uncomfortable. They're called a onin in Jewish law. Until the deceased is buried, everyone's uncomfortable. Sometimes, in my experience, you don't even feel that the children will not even, they'll never be able to handle life again. Then the body goes, and suddenly there's a level of comfort. So what we see here is the Shiva, the lack of comfort that we have, is also related to the lack of comfort that the deceased has. The deceased is not comfortable until they're buried. So that's why the person came to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and he said, thank you. He said, you can relax because now I can relax. Put your mind to rest because you have put my mind to rest. This is a very interesting thing about mourners. When people a lot of times, unfortunately, don't mourn someone, sometimes I feel they never get to that place of rest, right? Because the soul is not at rest. So that's the purpose. That's what happens during the Shiva. And that's what happens when we bury the person. They come to a place of rest, and therefore the mourners come to a place of rest. We're in fact feeling them. The mourners are in fact feeling the deceased's pain and the deceased's lack of comfort and the deceased, I guess, the deceased is uncomfortable. And when we become comfortable, that's actually because they are becoming comfortable. This is what it says here, right? He doesn't tell him you can. He doesn't say thank you, Rabbi Yehuda. Now I'm at rest. He says now you can rest because I'm resting now, right? That's what he tells Rabbi Yehuda in the dream. This is a very interesting excerpt in the Talmud. All right, now this is going to get even more interesting. Amar Rabbi Abahu. Rabbi Abahu says, Kol shomer b'fnei emes. Everything people say before the deceased, yoidea, he knows. Ad sheyisasim hagoylo, until the tomb is sealed with the top stone. The different opinions of what that means. Sometimes it means when they're totally covered, or sometimes it means the casket is totally covered. There's a mound covering the whole thing, right? So everything that people say, he hears until it is sealed with the top stone. Fascinating, right? So actually, we think that a dead body cannot hear anything. In fact, Rabbi Avo says they could hear. They could hear what you said. In fact, they hear everything. Perhaps they even hear what you're thinking, right? Prove me wrong. I wouldn't know how to disprove this, right? Okay. Because it's hard to ask them. They can't talk back. They can only listen, right? Ravi Chiya and Ravi Shimon. Barabi, Chad Amar Ashitsas Magoilo, V'chad Amar Ashisakal Abasar. What does that mean? Rabbi Chia and the son of Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, disagreed with regard to the meaning of this statement. One of them said that the deceased is aware until the tomb is sealed with the top stone, which is referring to the covering of the grave, right? And the other one says, actually, they can hear until the flesh decomposes. So here we have a dispute of that statement. Rabbi Abo was an earlier rabbi. He says, when the tomb is sealed, and two rabbis argue, what does that mean? One rabbi says literally until the tomb is covered, and the other one says no, it means until the flesh decomposes. As long as there is flesh, they can hear, right? As long as there is flesh, they can hear. This is a Jewish book. This is actually quite fascinating. Now, this gets very interesting. Jerry, you have a question? I just want to note that this would be probably impossible to scientifically prove or disprove, because we do not yet have any equipment that can tell us if they hear. Obviously, they're not physically hearing like we are, right? But they can hear. Who knows, right? You can't disprove it. So anyways, that is a dispute between Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon. One says they can hear until their grave is covered, and then they stop hearing. And one says they can actually, when you go to a grave, perhaps within the first few months or the first year, and the body hasn't decomposed yet, you can actually speak to them, and they hear what you're doing. And that's why in Jewish tradition we go, and people do actually speak to them, right? Now, just to add, in Jewish tradition, tzaddikim, righteous people never decompose. Really righteous people who never did anything wrong, their body doesn't have to go through the decomposing. Now, that sounds interesting. If you Google bodies not decomposing, you'll see a lot of creepy things online. You can see a lot of creepy pictures. Some reason certain bodies don't decompose. This is, there's evidence of that. Just make sure you're not doing it while you're eating your breakfast. The tzaddikim don't decompose. There are some stories that we have anecdotally of modern day times where people had to move a grave of someone. In Russia, sometimes they would, take a graveyard and dig it up, and they would make it into a building or something like that. So people, they knew their rabbi was there. They would dig up the rabbi and bury him in a safe place. And there are some anecdotal stories with fascinating evidence. There's a really creepy one that happened in 1953 in France. There's certain cemeteries that what they do is every couple of years they kind of grind up the cemetery and reuse it, right? And so there was someone there that they saved it, and it's a fascinating story, not for now, but they dug up someone who was 15 years after their burial. But anyways, that means that if they never decompose, right, they're always there. And that's why people go to places like the Ohel of the Rebbe, They know that this is a righteous person. If they didn't decompose, they're always there. They're always listening. Okay, but anyways, going back to here, we're talking about regular people who do decompose. Average Joe decomposes. You can look online if you don't believe me. You can see there are some people, for some reason, that they've been dug up and they didn't decompose. I don't know if they were righteous or not, but they are for sure creepy. Okay. Man da Amar ad she'yisach al habasar. The one who says until the flesh decomposes. Where does he know this from? How does he know that a person stops hearing? Now we're going to explain all this more and dig into it deeper. It says, but his flesh grieves for him and his soul mourns for him. This indicates that the deceased is aware of the pain of his flesh in the grave. The one who said that the deceased is aware only until the tomb is sealed with a top stone can support his view based on what's written. It says, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God. This is a verse that we say at the funeral. It says, when the body becomes dust, only then does the soul leave, right? That's what the verse says. That indicates that until the body decomposes, the soul is there, and the soul is still active, right? So this is a dispute in the Talmud, and we're going to dig into it deeper, even more. And let me just explain. Okay, any questions so far? Jerry, you have any questions? I think you do. Okay.
Lots, but I'll delay him.
Okay, so we'll give some explanations, and then we'll understand this more, and then we'll end off talking about people who are buried in Israel and what that means. And we asked earlier, why do we need to go through tunnels, right? Why don't we just dig them up? What's going on here? And it's all connected to the Parsha, because this is the Parsha where Jacob died and he wanted to be buried in Israel. And then we find many people we find opinions that you shouldn't be buried in Israel. Don't bring your impurity to Israel, right? But anyways, we'll talk about that. All right. All right, I'm going to share a screen now. And we're going to explain this, and we're going to explain these two verses here. Now, everyone sees the screen I have here?
Yes.
I typed these things on Word. You see what I typed on Word, or you see the Talmud? Okay. All right, so this is what they both said. Let me just go back, and we'll talk about these two opinions. One opinion says that the body can hear. The soul is still in the body. Right? Now let's just go back. What does it mean the body can hear? Right? Now, when we talk about, when I was a baby, right, they would do certain things to see if the baby would react and can hear. Then later on, they started sticking equipment, right, that they can actually see the brain listening, right? They can see movement in the brain from sounds that they made. They can check even better if a baby can hear. What does it mean that someone can hear or someone can feel? So in Jewish tradition, I think pretty much everyone will agree, when we know we hear, when we know we feel, is when we have a life force in ourselves. When there's no life force, the body's dead, we can't hear, right? So the body's not hearing, it's really the soul, the life force hearing, right? The body's not speaking, bodies don't speak, dead bodies can't speak. It's the life force speaking. Everyone agree with that? Everyone got that so far? All right. So what they're saying here is if the body can hear, even after it died, all they're saying is there is a remnant of the soul in the body, right? So the soul, because bodies don't hear, souls hear, right? If we build a ear, and it's a perfect ear, and we build it out of in the chemistry lab, it won't be able to hear until there is a life force in it, right? So what those rabbis are saying is that after the body dies, until a certain point, there is soul left in the body. And that soul can still hear, can still relate, and it can still speak, so to speak, still communicate. Later on in the Talmud, it actually says that one time a guy was digging up his backyard and he found a body there. And the body started talking to him. And he said, "What are you doing here?" He says, "I'm dead." He says, "So what do you mean you're dead? I'll bring you up. You're alive." He says, "No, I died." And the Talmud talks about it. This is a righteous person, and he's still able to communicate because soul still resides in his body. But he says, "Why? What do you mean you're dead?" He says, "Well, God said that I should die, so I died, and I had them bury me." Right? So that's an interesting story, which should explain this even better. Okay. So now, when we're talking about the soul There are actually 5 parts of the soul. Every person has 5 parts of the soul. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechid. And I'll just write it in English here, just to clarify and make it clear. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yechida.
We can't see that, Rabbi.
Oh, you see the Talmud screen?
No.
What do
We
you
see a screen that says Safaria on top.
All right, great. So let me share a different screen. Okay, great.
Okay.
So now we'll get back to the Safaria screen. Safaria is a really great library, Jewish library online. They have every book. Not every, but a lot. Okay, these are the 5 layers of the soul.
I can see it so far.
Now we all have layers in the soul, and we can actually see them. And I'll explain where we can see them. You can have someone who's alive, right? Right? You can have someone who's alive, but practically speaking, they cannot do anything, right? They're a vegetable. They're called a vegetable in modern science, right? They seem brain dead. They're brain dead. They're hooked up to machines, but they're still alive, right? And a lot of times it's quite fascinating. We do not know what the difference is, why they suddenly die. A lot of people, we feel like they should have been dead a long time ago, right? And there's something's keeping them alive. All right. Then you have a person who is conscious. You have a person whose subconscious brain is working. They're consciously brain dead, but they can't speak or anything like that, but subconsciously working, right? We see different layers in people, right? Everyone knows what I'm talking about? Okay. You see someone who's highly spiritual. They have intuition. They're intuitive, right? Sometimes Jewish moms, Jewish women, they're spookily intuitive, right? They're like, this is going to happen and it doesn't make any sense and it happens. Sometimes every single person sometimes has a feeling, there's a very interesting law about breaking Shabbos. So you're breaking Shabbos for a sick person. Sometimes if you have a sick person who says, I need to break Shabbos, otherwise I'm going to die. And the doctor says he's going to be fine. The Talmud says we listen to the person because sometimes a person just knows. He just has the sixth sense. He just knows, right? So we have all these layers in human people. I know people who can see ghosts and talk to ghosts, right? We all do. They're online with us today, right? There are all of these different layers of communication that we have. So here in right in the beginning of Genesis in the Midrash, it says that there are actually 5 layers to the soul. 5 layers to the soul. One above the other. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yechida. Now, the true highest level is the Yechida. The Yechida, I'll work down, is called the Pintele Yid. That is the point that a person is a Jew on a mission, right? Pintele Yid means the point of a Jew, right? That is the part that comes out on Yom Kippur. That is the part comes out when a Jew is giving his life for Judaism. All the people who died in the Holocaust, that came out, right? They're about to die. They're singing the Shema. They're singing Animam, and some of them are even dancing, right? Because it doesn't make any sense. But we're Jewish. We have a mission. God's with us, right? That is the Yechida. And that's what we have on Yom Kippur. Chaya is the soul. Our soul has expressions, right? Our spiritual soul has expressions. It has rules. The Yechida has no rules. The Yechida is just one with God. It doesn't have any rules. It does crazy things. Sometimes Jews do crazy things. A lot of times it's the Yechida. They're crazily Jewish. The Chaya is the soul, right? The soul, the godly soul. The way it is above the body. Before you were born, you had a soul. It thinks. It's a creature. It thinks. It talks spiritually. Then you have the Neshama. Neshama means a breath. The soul is breathed into. God blows it into the body. That is the Neshama. So the body's alive, right? Sometimes he's alive. He can't do anything. He's incapacitated. God forbid someone's incapacitated, right? But they are able, they're still alive. Then you have, just right, breath, right? It's just the fact that the soul, the person's alive. That's a lower layer of the soul, which goes into the body. Then you have a ruach. Ruach means spirit, right? It means like a wind, a spirit. This actually gives life to the body. It makes you think. It makes you feel, right? And then we have nefesh. Nefesh is the lowest level. The lowest level, it doesn't really think, doesn't really feel so much, but it hears, it talks, it can do things. That's the lowest level of soul, right? They, some of you guys probably know people who have no brains, but they're out there doing things, right? They're not thinking. Think, for God's sake, right? Think, feel. What do you feel about it? What
That's
do you
true.
think about it, right? A lot of it, nefesh. They're able to do. They're driving the car, right? They're driving the car. They're a safer driver than you are, but they just have no brains, right? They're not okay, right? So that is nefesh. That's the lowest level. So when you take this into context, we're really in touch with three parts of the soul, and barely this one here. Chaya is not in the body. It's above the body. It surrounds the body, right? It's highly spiritual. Yechida is way beyond us, but it's in us. Neshama is the fact that we have a life force in us. We're alive. Ruach is the fact that we have, spiritual capabilities. I mean, we think thinking and feeling is spiritual, right? But that's not even spiritual when you're talking with spiritual people, right? But for us, that's really spiritual. We're able to think, we're able to feel, we're able to desire things, right? And then you have nefesh. Nefesh is the lowest. The lowest part of the soul is nefesh. Nefesh is the part which is practical. All right, now let's go back to that excerpt in the Talmud, and we'll reread it. We'll reread it, and we'll see something very fascinating. So we said before, everyone sees this over here? All right, so we said that the body can hear until until the top stone is sealed. We asked, what does that mean? What point is that the body stops hearing? One rabbi said, it's when the grave is covered. Another rabbi said, when the body decomposes, right? Right? That's what they said. So now let's look at the verses they used to prove. This is going to be something very fascinating, because we're going to see that according to some opinions, they're actually not fully arguing here. They're actually referring to a different level of consciousness. Man da Amar, Man da Amar, the one who says Ad she'isakal basar d'chsiv, ach besari alav yichav v'nafshe alav tevel. It says, but his flesh grieves for him and his soul mourns for him, right? So after he dies, his flesh can still feel. What word does it use for his soul? Anyone who's reading Hebrew? Nefesh. Nefesh, right? The nefesh is still there. The nefesh is still in the body. What part of the body is nefesh? Nefesh, we said, is the lowest part of the soul. The lowest part of the soul is there. The rest of the soul, right? The one, as long as the body is there, the lowest part of the soul is there. Why can't he move? Why can't he talk? The conscious, lowest part of the soul, which is the most conscious, is still there. Why can't he do anything? Because the other parts of the soul is left. They're like the battery for the lowest part of the soul, right? So if you want to talk, if you want to say something, you need the higher parts of the soul. You need the whole soul. But the higher parts left when he died, when he was buried. So now only the lower part of the soul remains until he decomposes. You got it? The lower part of the soul remains until he decomposes. So that is why he uses that verse. He says, "V'nafshe alav teval," the lower part of the soul. He can't speak because he doesn't have the higher parts of the soul. Where did they go? They went to heaven, right? They're gone when he died. The reason why he stops speaking when he dies is not because he's fully dead yet. It's because a major part of his soul has left. But there's still, the most conscious part of the soul is still tied to his body. That's why he's able to hear until he decomposes. That's why it's important what we say when we're at cemeteries near different bodies. They can still hear because there's a lower part of the soul remaining with that body. That is what that verse says. Okay, now the second verse. Now this is very interesting. He doesn't quote the full verse. He says, "V'yafshav ha'afar al haaretz kishahaya." The verse says, "And the dust returns to the earth as it was. Va'ruach tashav elokim asher nasana." And the ruach, right? The ruach is a higher part of the soul. When a person dies, right away, the highest parts of the soul leave, but there's still the lower parts. They're used to living. They're still there. The second opinion says, right away when he's buried, the ruach leaves. The ruach is the part of the soul which gives life to the body. It's subconscious. It gives life to the body and helps us think and it helps us feel, right? That leaves right when he's buried. So really, these two opinions aren't arguing. This is what happens. When someone dies, right? When someone dies, they're still there. As long as their body is there, a piece of their soul is there. When they're buried, their ruach leaves. Their ruach goes to the world to come, goes to heaven. Now their ruach leaves, all that remains is their nefesh. The nefesh is a conscious part of the body. That's still conscious part of the soul. That's still in their body. They can still hear. But their ruach leaves. One opinion says once their ruach leaves, that's the main part, right? So they can't really hear, right? But they're still there. The other opinion says, no, the nefesh, as long as the nefesh is still there until the body decomposes, the conscious part of the soul is still there. There's still a piece of soul. They can still hear. They can still hear. Either way, both of them, they're considered legally dead because a major part of their soul has left. So they can't speak to us. When we say someone's dead, it's actually very interesting historically. The definition of dead has changed drastically throughout the years. In the olden days, right, dead meant someone can't move and they're not breathing. Now we know that death means their brain died, right? We have all different measuring sticks of how we define death. And as history goes on, we're finding out more and more that people are still alive, right? We don't know. We could just do our best. But in the olden days, the definition of death was a pretty low definition. They're not moving. Their body's, cold. It's not alive, right? They're not breathing. Nowadays, when that happens, we say, here, quickly, get a defibrillator. Maybe there's something still running in them that we can activate. So these two rabbis, what they're explaining is when someone dies and we consider them dead, we have to bury them. But they can still hear because there's still a part of the soul in the body. One rabbi says, what part of the soul remains? A part of the soul remains, the ruach, the higher part of the soul remains as soon as they're buried. The second opinion says, no, as long as their body is there, they can still hear until they decompose. Once they decompose, that conscious part of their body, which is embedded in their system, leaves. It has nowhere to stand anymore. So that is just a fascinating thing. So going back, the Rebbe was saying that so as long as the body has not decomposed yet, there's soul in the body. There's a person there. They're actually alive. Maybe not medically alive. Maybe we don't see how they're alive. Maybe we can't define them as alive. We can't speak to them. They're decomposing, right? But there's actually still life in them. And that's why it's so important not to cremate. All right, so that is the first point that we're talking about here, how actually they can hear and they can actually communicate in a certain sense, and they're actually somewhat alive, but a major part of their soul has left, so they're just slightly alive. But that is actually why it's so important, that death wishes and stuff like that. And as we see, Shiva is the process. Now, how long does it take for the body to decompose? Anyone know? So average opinion in the Talmud, the average is 12 months. That's average. Some less, some more, some never decomposed, right? We have a tradition that Jacob never decomposed. Again, if you want to see people who haven't decomposed, Google it. I dare you. Okay. They'll haunt your dreams. Okay. So for those 12 months, while we're mourning them, right? We mourn for 12 months. It's actually because they're still in their body. There's still a life force in there. They're still somewhat alive in this world. They're very alive in the spiritual world, but in this world, they're somewhat alive. And as long as they're alive, they're not at rest. Because they're literally stuck between two worlds. And that's why we feel uncomfortable for a year and we say Kaddish for them and everything like that. And for a year, and we sit Shiva, and these processes, these stages of mourning are actually the mourning of the soul leaving the body and the body feeling the pain of leaving this world, which it's painful for him because until he's in the other side, he doesn't really know, what it's going to be like. He's still stuck over here. So this is just a, fascinating discussion. I'm going to stop here. I know I promised we'll talk about being buried in Israel, which is equally fascinating, but I see we're going to go way over time if we do that. And I don't want to go too much over time here, but this is a fascinating discussion in the Talmud of how we treat mourning. Now I'll just share the story of how we know to say Kaddish. There's actually a story in the Talmud of in the Zohar says Rabbi Akiva was once, he had Aliyah Saneshama. So, we're talking about two worlds. There are two worlds out there, so to speak, the spiritual and the physical. Most of us are in one and then we're in the other. We can't really fathom the next world. There's some great rabbis, the same rabbis who never decompose, they're able to be in two worlds at one time because the whole time they're with God, right? They don't see a physical world, right? So Rabbi Akiva was one of those rabbis. He was able to go to the spiritual worlds even while he was alive. Anyways, he's there and he sees a guy schlepping wood, burning them until he's totally burnt with them. So Rabbi Akiva tells him, he says, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, I wasn't a very, I didn't, I did some sins. I don't remember exactly what. But every day my punishment is I got to go and burn myself in this wood, chop wood and burn myself in this spiritual wood, whatever it means." Rabbi Akiva was so hurt. He said, "Is there anything I can do to help you be at rest in the world to come?" So he said, "Yes, I have a son who lives in this town. If you can tell him to say Kaddish," this was before Kaddish was popular. He says, "If you can tell him to say Kaddish, then it'll save me. And furthermore, if he'll become observant, if he'll become a rabbi, then that'll be really good for me." So Rabbi Akiva saw this suffering soul, and he traveled to that town, and he went to the son, and he said, "Your dad, let me tell you about your dad." And the son said, "Teach me Torah." And he became a great rabbi, and he said Kaddish for his father. And Rabbi Akiva went, and he said he went to the guy, and the guy said, "Thank you so much. You saved me up here. Now I'm at rest." And now, not only that, but I get to spend time with the great rabbis in the yeshiva of heaven. So that's actually the source for saying Kaddish, one of the sources in the Zohar. And based on that, in the Code of Jewish Law, it says when someone passes, one should say Kaddish for them for 11 months to put them at rest. Again, 11 months is when everyone's in this limbo, where they're in this world and they're in the world to come. It's messy. You say Kaddish for 11 months, and even better, to study Torah for them and do mitzvahs for them in their merit, and that will help their soul even more. All right, we'll stop here. Any questions?
Rabbi,
Yes.
is there any connection between the time frame for the unveiling and the?
Yes, I'm sure there is. Believe it or not, Chabad Hasidim do the unveiling at the end of Shiva. They do it very, very fast. The Chabad custom is to do the unveiling very, very fast. I'm not actually sure off the top of my head the reason for that. I'm also not sure what the time, but all these time frames are related to the soul leaving the body. It's a process. We think we see someone getting sick and then they die. That's the end of the process. Really, the process of the soul leaving, it takes longer. And, it's important, in Jewish tradition, when you go into a cemetery, one is supposed to put their tzitzis in their pocket. Not to make the people feel jealous. Again, they could still communicate. And they come and they see this guy doing mitzvahs in the cemetery. They could still communicate with each other and with us. As we see in the story of Rabbi Yehuda that we mentioned, the guy came to him and said, "Thank you. Now you can be at rest because I'm at rest." Rabbi Yehuda obviously in that story felt not at rest. He said, "We better get a Shiva minyan for this guy." He was somehow connected to this guy. That's what woke him up to do it. And lo and behold, Rabbi Yehuda, they sit Shiva for him. They didn't sit Shiva, but they made a minyan in his house for 7 days, even though no one was sitting Shiva. And after that, the guy said, "Thank you. Now you can rest because I am at rest." There's many layers of the soul leaving. The rest means the soul leaving the body. When the soul is in this world, he lives one type of life. When he lives in the world to come, he lives another type of life. Until then, he's in between. He's doing both. There will be opinions that say, so now these two rabbis are arguing what layer they're talking about what layer of the soul is there. There's one layer there for until when soul is buried, some of the soul can leave. When someone decomposes, some more of the soul can leave, right? But then there's a certain part in Jewish tradition that never decomposes, right? Jerry, you know about that part?
What part?
It never decomposes, a part of the body which never decomposes.
Well, is this a joke or what?
No, what, does DNA decompose, Jerry? Does DNA decompose?
Does DNA decompose? No.
Some of it can.
All right, well, so we know about parts that don't decompose, at least in our lifetime. So yeah, Jewish tradition has a part that doesn't decompose. We're not exactly sure what it is, but so as long as that part remains in the earth, in this world, some of that soul remains in this earth. Anyways, yeah, we can see there's DNA from, I mean, dinosaurs and all sorts of different things, right? So there's a part, and the soul is long, there's a remnant of the soul, but the parts of the soul which can communicate in this world, they actually stay in this world for the part of the souls which can communicate only stay until the body decomposes, the majority at least. All right, I'm going to. Yeah, you have anyone have a question? Rochelle, do you have a question?